Show. I'm excited to welcome the host of the Dr. Robert Marks Show, Dr. Marks. Dr. Marks, how are you? I know you're excited about our guest today.
Yes, he has a great set of topics. He has been a New York Times bestseller, and that's what I want to ask him about.
All right. So
Fire
excited.
away.
All right.
Tom,
Uh-huh.
Tom, your last New York Times bestseller, I believe, was Throne of Grace, but you have a new book coming out, Bandit Heaven. Can you give our listeners an overview of what's in that book?
Well, I'll first explain the title. Bandit Heaven was a nickname given to three different locations along the so-called Outlaw Trail. There was Browns Hole. There was this is all throughout the Colorado, Utah, and Mexico. The Outlaw Trail really extended from the Canadian border to the Mexican border. These outlaws could ride this trail and stop off at the hole in the wall in Wyoming. They could stop off at Robber's Roost. They could stop off at Brown's Hole. Each of these places were very hard to access, especially for lawmen, especially. Two of them were very remote places. So they offered safety. You had a bunch of bandits might have just robbed a train. They made their way to one of these sanctuaries, and they could be protected there by other bandits. And it was hard to access them, so the lawmen usually said, well, "It's too risky. I won't go there." So Bandit Heaven is the name that was given to these three safe havens because it was a place they could sit back and relax and basically plan their next job.
And Tom, we've
Freshman,
talked. Good, Dr. Marks. I was going to get a question.
no,
Tom and
just a
I have
follow-up
talked
question.
multiple times on my program, and Westerns are the way you go, right? And you continue to write them. And do you see there's such a popularity with this for sure?
It's a very interesting thing that's happening right now in American culture because Western books, both fiction and nonfiction, are quite popular. The Western Writers of America is a very active organization, and their people are publishing, they're getting their books published. I've been very fortunate that my books get published, and they often end up on bestsellers. People are buying my books because they enjoy the topics, and I guess they enjoy the writing. It's quite different now. Suddenly, it's rather quite different as far as Westerns on screen. You could say, well, what about Yellowstone? But Yellowstone is 4 or 5 years old now, and is also not a period Western, meaning it takes place in contemporary times. You're hard to find either feature films or television shows, in which case in Western times taking place in the 1880s and 1890s. And that could be, it looked like that might have been changing. In fact, I was working on an adaptation for screen adaptation of my book Dodge City, but then Kevin Costner's movie Horizon came out, and it did so poorly at the box office. I've seen the movie, I think it's a good movie, but it did so poorly at the box office that a lot of screen people are saying, don't go near Westerns. So Western books, popular. Western movies and TV series, unpopular.
And that again, the probably one platform would be really good. We work with them on a regular basis is INSP. That really is given a big hub for original programming that are
Right.
Westerns. And I guess that you have a niche audience, not a broad audience. For some reason, books, we have a broad audience for
Hmm.
Westerns.
Yes.
Uh,
Yeah, yeah. I think one of the Bandit Heaven, some of the advanced reviews for Bandit Heaven were that I saw on different sites were written by women, which is interesting because I really made a specific effort with Bandit Heaven to include female characters because there were female characters. They often get excluded from stories because they're not the main cat. They're not Wyatt Earp. They're not Bat Masterson. But in Bandit Heaven, for every Butch Cassidy and Sundance Kid and Kid Curry and Tall Texan Kilpatrick, there's a woman that was involved with them directly or was part of their gang, or actually in the case of like Etta Place, who became eventually Mrs. Sundance, actually participated in some of their robberies.
okay. Good, Dr. Marks.
How does a kid from Brooklyn like yourself get interested and dig out details about the Wild West between roughly 1880 and 1900?
Well, I think um, I'm an age where, as a kid, you could turn on the television. You could find shows like Bonanza and The Big Valley and Rawhide and shows like that. And also, it was not unusual to go see a double feature on a Saturday or a Sunday, and you're seeing a couple of Westerns. They could be starring Cornell Wilde, Audie Murphy, Richard Widmark, Henry Fonda, James Stewart. They were still doing Westerns. The very young Clint Eastwood was doing the spaghetti Westerns. So
Oh
I
yeah.
had a very keen interest in the Western genre from early on. That didn't guarantee I was going to be able to write about it. What really changed was I guess I could say Dodge City. That was supposed to be a one-off. I wanted to do a story about Wyatt Earp and Bat Masterson when they were close friends in their 20s and trying to tame the town that was called the wickedest town in the American West. And when the book came out, I was already embarked on a different book on a totally different subject, but the book was so successful and continues to be that my publisher said, "Can we keep doing more about the American West? You seem to have tapped into a real audience for the Dodge City. Can we keep it going?" And that's where we ended up with Wild Bill, Tombstone, Follow Me to Hell, The Last Outlaws, and now Bandit Heaven.
Go ahead, Dr. Marks.
Interesting. What piqued my interest is how do you research this? How do you get out all this nitty-gritty detail that is the heart and soul of making your books really great?
I think one reason is because I like to go back to the original contemporary sources. What was being written about these people and these events at the time. When Butch Cassidy and his gang robbed the train, the Wilcox train, it was called, in Wilcox, Wyoming. That was a big news. And so the newspapers for hundreds of miles around were covering that story and interviewing the conductor and interviewing the fireman of the train. So you get a lot of details from just what was written about at the time these events are taking place. And I think another part of it is persistence. If I might come across a character in a book that I'm writing about because he helped rob a train with some other gang member who I'm writing about. And you might just mention him once, mention him twice. But what I'll do is I'll pause a moment and say, let me see if this guy's got a backstory or something interesting happened to him or will happen to him. So I'll look it up, and sometimes it'll come out to be an interesting story on its own right. Sometimes it'll be a footnote. George Big Beak Parrott, I think, is a good example of that. I mean, he's an outlaw who eventually justice was done, you can say, and he ended up as a pair of shoes. So, that's the kind of detail I never found anyplace else, but I did some extra research on it, that this man ended up as a pair of shoes.
So
Do
you'll
you
continue to be writing Westerns, it sounds like, Tom.
Well, I'd like to. I mean, I do enjoy the genre. It's not the only genre I enjoy. The book I'm working on right now is about a World War II submarine, which is kind of refreshing to switch gears sometimes and write about something different, then come back to the West. But I have a couple other ideas to work on, and I do enjoy them. And what's most important is that I get such good feedback from people. When I go on the road, when I give talks, people are coming up and saying, "I so enjoyed your book. I can't wait for your next one. I read your 2 books ago." And if people are coming up to me and saying, "Stop writing Westerns, we don't like them," I'll stop.
Nobody has said that yet, have they?
Not to my face.
Now, Throne of Grace was your previous book last year, and it became a New York Times bestseller. Is that correct?
That's with Bob Drury. That was about Jedediah Smith, the great explorer and mountain man.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Now, what era was that in? That was not below that was before 1880s, I believe. Is that correct?
Yes, it was mostly takes place in the 1820s because Jedediah Smith makes his first appearance in 1822 in St. Louis. And pretty much when he dies in 1831, that's pretty much the end of the story. So it's mostly that decade of the 1820s when the mountain men there were tons of beaver to catch, and that's what they were after in the American West.
Yeah.
All
You
right.
ever
Well,
write a book about Jim Bridger?
Not specifically about him. There's a book coming out soon by a fellow named Bill Markley on Jim Bridger. I'm sure it's going to be a good one. But Jim Bridger is a very prominent character in another book I did with Bob Drury called The Heart of Everything That Is, about the Sioux Indian leader Red Cloud.
Oh,
Jim Bridger was a scout for the Army that encountered Red Cloud and his forces in the mid to late 1860s in what was called Red Cloud's War. So we have and he's also mentioned a few times in Throne of Grace too, because he was one of the very young mountain men of that period.
okay. Well, this is very, very intriguing stuff so far that we're talking about. What do you think? What do you want your readers to get most out of your latest book?
Fun. And I mean that seriously, because I think if a book's not fun to read, I don't want people to read the book saying, "Well, I got to keep reading this. I'm not enjoying it. I got to keep reading it because it's well researched." Well, I'm glad you think it's well researched, and that's a very important part of what I do. But don't feel like you have to read it because it's got a lot of details. It's something you want to read. There's a lot of stories in Bandit Heaven, and I think compared to my other books, I might have more action than my other books because there was so much happening in the 1890s in the American West that people don't know about. So if it's fun, if you want to keep turning the pages, read the book, but don't force yourself to do it if it's just not fun.
Okay. Last
Tom,
question, Dr. Marks. What do you have
Oh yeah, Tom. You say you kind of have appearances, and I see there's a couple in Kansas coming up. Do you have any more coming up in other areas other than the Midwest?
Nothing scheduled right now. I do have next Monday, I'll be in St. Louis. Next Tuesday, I'll be in Wichita. And next Wednesday, I'll be in Kansas City. Haven't added anything onto it. It's kind of hard. You know, the days of the long book tours are over. Publishers don't want to underwrite them. And a lot of times, you know, you can show up someplace, there's only like four people waiting for you. So they become a lot more conservative in book tours. That's fine with me because I used to go on book tours that could be 2 weeks long and you have 12 different engagements in 2 weeks. It's rather exhausting. I'm not a spring chicken anymore. So three or four gigs in a week is enjoyable because I meet people, but that's plenty for me.
That's
Right.
interesting. What do you think the reason for those changes? Now, you said they don't want to underwrite them or it's not really profitable for the publisher.
You know, there's so much more dependence now on online advertising and online publicity. There's so many people, especially because of the pandemic, they found that you don't have to send an author on the road if you could do these virtual appearances by Zoom. So so a lot of authors are saying, I don't feel like living out of a suitcase for 10 days. Set me up with a bunch of Zoom things. I like doing some personal appearances because you get to see people, shake their hands, personally inscribe their books and sign their books. But I'm happy not having to be on the road for 2 weeks.
All right. Where's the best place people can buy your book? Is Amazon? Do you have a website as well, Tom?
Yes, Tom Clavin, TomClavin, TomClavin.com.
All right, Tom, we appreciate it. Thanks again.
Thank you very much. Good to see
All
you.
right. That was a special simulcast of the Neil Haley Show on the Dr. Robert